Imagine standing on the battlements of a walled city in the 14th century. The air is heavy, not just with the smoke of battle, but with something you cannot see. Something that clings to your breath, lurks in the dust, and rides the bodies of rats and fleas. Below the walls, an enemy army gathers. You expect arrows, stones, and fire. But what comes next is unlike anything the world had seen before. From great wooden catapults, the enemy begins to hurl bodies. Rotting corpses, bloated, blackened, twisted with disease. Over the walls and into the city streets. They are not weapons forged of steel, but of death itself. And within days, the city collapses. Not to swords, not to sieges, but to an invisible, unstoppable plague. This is not the stuff of dark fantasy or horror novels. This is a moment etched into the chronicles of history. The terrifying account of armies that may have weaponized the deadliest pandemic in human memory. The Black Death. We all know the plague as a disease, a nightmare of history that erased nearly half of Europe's population in just a few short years. But fewer know the darker whispers, the stories of plague warriors, soldiers and commanders who allegedly turned pestilence itself into a weapon of war. These are tales of men who spread infection through poisoned wells, through contaminated cloth, and through the corpses of plague victims hurled across enemy lines. They are stories of villages that swore shadowy armies carried the plague deliberately, unleashing it like a curse. Were they real? Or were they the invention of terrified minds, struggling to explain the inexplicable? The very idea is chilling. It changes the way we view medieval warfare. It wasn't just knights clashing in shining armor, or castles burning under siege. It wasn't just banners, swords, and oaths of chivalry. No. If these accounts are true, there were moments when soldiers realized they had a weapon greater than any blade. The invisible enemy that no shield could block, no prayer could banish, no doctor could heal. The plague became not only a disaster of nature, but potentially the first biological weapon on a massive scale. And here's where the hook sharpens. Because history does not leave us with clear answers. We are left with fragments, accounts in old chronicles, hints in medieval letters, whispers that seem too incredible to believe, yet too persistent to ignore. Did armies truly weaponize the plague? Or were people simply looking for someone to blame? As death swept through their world? What makes this story powerful is not just the possibility of deliberate plague warfare, but the terror it ignited. In a world already drenched in superstition and fear, rumors spread faster than armies could march. Stories of plague warriors haunted towns and villages, feeding panic, dividing neighbors, driving violence against supposed conspirators. The plague killed millions, but the fear of human hands behind it, of enemies who could summon the sickness at will, may have destroyed just as much trust, just as much hope, as the disease itself. Tonight, we're going to dive into that hidden history. We'll uncover the chronicles that describe plague-ridden corpses used as weapons. We'll examine the siege of Caffa, where many believe the Black Death first leapt into Europe's bloodstream. We'll trace the legends of soldiers accused of carrying the plague deliberately, and ask the haunting question: were plague warriors real? Or were they simply the monsters, invented by desperate, grieving survivors of a dying world? Because here's the truth. Whether or not these plague warriors truly existed, their legend has endured. And legends, especially the ones tied to the greatest catastrophe of the Middle Ages, tell us something very real about fear, power, and the human mind in times of crisis. So stay with me. By the end of this story, you may find yourself wondering if death itself can march in formation, if disease can be trained like an army, and if mankind's darkest weapon has always been the one it cannot fully control. Before we descend into the shadow of the Black Death, we need to step back and look at the world that existed just before it struck. Medieval Europe in the early 14th century was not a land of peace or stability. It was a continent already straining under the weight of hunger, war, and superstition. A perfect breeding ground for panic when the plague arrived. The early 1300s were marked by what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of colder temperatures and unpredictable weather. Crops failed again and again. Harvests that had once fed villages with modest abundance now barely scraped by. Families weakened by famine. Malnutrition spread across kingdoms, making the population frail long before disease appeared. To many, these failing harvests seemed like a punishment from God, a sign that the heavens themselves were turning against humanity. And while nature tightened its grip, human conflict made things worse. Europe was not a unified continent. It was a patchwork of warring kingdoms, feudal lords, and ambitious rulers. The 100 Years' War between England and France was brewing. Trade rivalries stoked tension. Crusading zeal still lingered in the air. Soldiers marched, cities fortified themselves. And disease, when it came, would find no shortage of bodies huddled in camps, cramped towns, and crowded ships. But perhaps most dangerous of all was the mindset of the people. Medieval Europe was steeped in superstition. The church dominated life, and every unexplained event, drought, famine, sickness, was often interpreted through a lens of divine punishment or demonic influence. Doctors had little understanding of germs or contagion. Instead, many believed that bad air, curses, or even planetary alignment caused illness. It was a world where fear ruled reason, where whispers of unseen enemies, be they witches, heretics, or soldiers carrying plague, could ignite hysteria overnight. Now imagine living in this fragile world. You are a farmer in a small village. Your harvest has been poor for 3 years. Your neighbors are thin, desperate, and angry. Rumors spread that armies in distant lands are clashing. And with them comes news of strange new sicknesses, terrible afflictions that twist the body and bring death within days. You do not know science. You do not have medicine. What you have are stories. Stories told around the fire, in the tavern. Whispered by travelers on the road. Stories that enemies are poisoning wells. That soldiers in the East are using sickness itself as a weapon. That unseen forces march alongside armies. To the medieval mind, this did not sound impossible. Disease was already an invisible terror. And war had always been a bringer of famine, plague, and ruin. If your town was besieged, sickness often followed. If soldiers camped near your walls, pestilence often entered soon after. And so, when the plague finally came, the idea that it had been deliberately unleashed, that plague warriors walked among the armies, was not just believable. It was expected. There was another factor that primed Europe for the terror to come: trade. The medieval world was more connected than most people realize. Caravans stretched across Asia. Ships sailed between Black Sea ports and the bustling cities of the Mediterranean. Merchants carried silks, spices, and stories with them. Goods moved faster than ever before. And so did diseases. The pathways of commerce became highways of death once the plague appeared. And when rumors began to spread that soldiers in the East had hurled diseased bodies into cities under siege, Europeans were quick to link these tales to the devastation now racing along their own trade routes. This was the stage. A weakened, superstitious, war-torn continent, bound together by trade, yet divided by fear. A place where the line between myth and reality blurred easily, and where whispers of enemies wielding disease could spread as fast as the sickness itself. So when the Black Death struck in 1347, it did not descend upon a strong, stable society. It struck a Europe already on its knees, starving, fearful, and primed to see disease, not just as an act of God, but perhaps as the cruelest weapon ever wielded by man. The year was 1347, and whispers of a strange sickness were already echoing along the trade routes from Asia. Merchants, sailors, and soldiers carried more than just spices or silk. They carried death in forms no one could see. By the time the plague reached Europe, it had already left a trail of devastation across the East. But for those in the bustling ports of the Mediterranean, the true horror was just beginning. It started in the port city of Messina, in Sicily. Geno's trading ships sailed into harbor after a long journey from the Black Sea. The citizens expected goods, wealth, and news from distant lands. Instead, they were met with horror. Sailors staggered off the ships, covered in black boils, their bodies racked with fever and pain. Some collapsed on the docks before they could even speak. The plague had arrived, silently carried across the waves. The disease moved with terrifying speed. Within days, it spread through Messina. Families who had shared bread the night before were burying each other the next. Priests could not keep up with last rites. Grave diggers could not keep up with the dead. The city turned to chaos. People fled in every direction. But in running, they carried the sickness further still. From Sicily, the plague leapt like wildfire across Europe's trade routes. It reached Marseille, Genoa, and Venice, all thriving hubs of commerce. From there, it spread northward, following roads and rivers into the heart of France, Spain, and the Italian countryside. By 1348, it was consuming England, the Low Countries, and Germany. There was no wall high enough, no fortress strong enough, no border wide enough to contain it. The plague was unstoppable. But what terrified people most was the way it struck. Victims developed painful swellings, buboes, usually in the armpits or groin. Their skin blackened, giving the disease its grim name, the Black Death. Fever soared, coughs rattled, and within days, death followed. Families watched helplessly as loved ones wasted away in agony. Entire households vanished within a week. In some towns, half the population was gone before anyone understood what was happening. Imagine what this felt like to a medieval mind. You had no science to explain bacteria, or fleas, or rats. Instead, you believed in curses, in poisoned air, in the wrath of heaven. And when someone whispered that soldiers to the east had been seen hurling corpses over walls, that armies carried pestilence as a weapon, you listened, because the plague seemed to move as though guided by human hands, striking first in ports and fortresses, places where soldiers and merchants gathered. By the end of 1349, the Black Death had consumed nearly every corner of Europe. Cities like Florence and Paris, once centers of wealth and learning, became graveyards. London lost tens of thousands. Villages disappeared altogether, abandoned, as survivors fled or perished. The death toll rose beyond imagination. Some say a third of Europe. Others claim nearly half. And yet, through this horror, rumors continued to spread. People whispered of wells poisoned by enemies. Some claimed merchants carried tainted goods on purpose. Others said armies from the east had unleashed the plague deliberately. That what began as a sickness of nature had been turned into a weapon of war. Whether true or not, these stories took on lives of their own. In the chaos of the Black Death's arrival, fear blurred the line between disease and conspiracy, between chance and calculated destruction. The plague was here. It would not leave Europe for years. And as its shadow grew darker, one story above all would cement the legend of plague as a weapon: the terrifying siege of Caffa. The year was 1346, and the city of Caffa, today known as Feodosia, in Crimea, was a thriving Genoese trading port on the edge of the Black Sea. It was here, at this crossroads of East and West, that one of the most chilling stories of the Black Death unfolded. For centuries, it has stood as both a historical mystery and a terrifying legend. The tale of the Mongol siege that may have unleashed the plague on Europe. The Mongol Golden Horde, led by Khan Janibeg, laid siege to Caffa in the mid-1340s. This was not unusual. Caffa was a wealthy outpost of Italian merchants, and its riches made it a tempting target. But as the siege dragged on, something strange and horrifying began to happen. The Mongol army itself started to die. Reports say the soldiers were struck by a mysterious illness, one that killed them quickly and left their bodies bloated and blackened. The plague had reached the Mongols first. Most besieging armies might have retreated, fearing the invisible enemy tearing through their ranks. But according to one chronicler, a man named Gabriel de Mussy, the Mongols chose another path. They did not abandon the siege. Instead, they turned their fallen comrades into weapons. Using great catapults, they hurled plague-ridden corpses over the city walls, launching disease itself into the heart of Caffa. Imagine the terror inside the city. You are a merchant, standing behind the stone walls you thought would protect you, only to watch the sky darken with the arc of a catapult. Instead of fire or stone, the weapon delivers something far more dreadful. A rotting body, twisted with sickness, crashing into the streets where children play and families gather. No armor can block it. No prayer can cleanse it. And within days, people inside the walls begin to die. De Mus's account, written in Italy not long after, claimed that this act of biological warfare unleashed the Black Death on Europe. He described how ships fleeing Caffa carried the plague back to Genoa, Venice, and beyond, spreading the sickness across the continent. It is a story that has haunted history ever since. A tale of deliberate, calculated use of plague as a weapon of mass destruction. But was it true? That is the question historians continue to debate. Some argue that de Mussi never actually visited Caffa and may have relied on second-hand reports. Others point out that the plague was already moving westward along trade routes, and Caffa was simply one link in a chain of devastation. Still, the story refuses to fade. Why? Because it captures something deeper, the terrifying idea that humans could take nature's deadliest weapon and aim it at their enemies. Whether entirely factual or not, the siege of Caffa became the foundation for the legend of plague warriors. To the people of medieval Europe, it was proof that men could weaponize pestilence. That armies could march, with death itself at their command. And once the story took hold, it grew. Villages began to whisper that enemy forces had poisoned wells. That wandering soldiers carried disease on purpose. That invisible armies of sickness followed in their wake. The siege of Caffa is a hinge point in this story. If the chronicles are accurate, then it may represent one of the first recorded acts of biological warfare in history. If the accounts were exaggerated, then it still reveals something just as powerful. How quickly fear could transform disease into a weapon of the imagination. Either way, from that moment forward, plague was no longer seen only as a curse of God or an accident of fate. It was a weapon. One that could be wielded, controlled, unleashed. And with the Black Death spreading across Europe, the myth of plague warriors only grew stronger. The Black Death spread like wildfire across Europe. But alongside the sickness came something else. Rumors. Stories whispered in village taverns, carried by frightened travelers, muttered by priests who could not explain what was happening. These were the tales of plague warriors. Men who, it was said, used the disease itself as a weapon. Soldiers who poisoned wells with infected matter. Armies who spread sickness by leaving tainted clothes in abandoned houses. Riders who carried the plague with them like a curse, releasing it on towns before disappearing into the night. To a terrified population, already drowning in superstition, these stories made perfect sense. After all, hadn't the Mongols hurled corpses over the walls of Caffa? Hadn't the sickness followed soldiers and merchants wherever they went? If death could march with armies once, why not again? Imagine yourself in a medieval village. You wake one morning to find 3 of your neighbors dead, their bodies swollen and blackened. The priest says it is God's punishment, but a traveler swears he saw strange men by the river days earlier, dropping something into the water. Another villager insists he saw riders passing by in the night, cloaked and silent, leaving behind bundles of rags. Soon, the sickness spreads through your street. What conclusion do you reach? To the medieval mind, it was clear, enemies had brought the plague deliberately. Armies had become carriers of invisible death. The legends spread faster than the plague itself. Some swore that French soldiers poisoned wells in Flanders. Others believed wandering mercenaries carried jars of plague matter, spreading them for gold. In Germany, rumors claimed Jews had poisoned the water supplies, a lie that led to horrific massacres and pogroms. The fear of plague warriors turned neighbor against neighbor, stranger against stranger, and left villages ready to believe the darkest accusations without proof. But here's the haunting truth. There was no way to prove any of it. Disease was invisible, its movements mysterious. When death came to a town, people needed an explanation. And blaming plague warriors gave them one. It was easier to imagine an enemy army unleashing sickness than to accept that the world itself had turned against them. And yet, the rumors persisted because they fit so well with reality. Armies had always brought famine and pestilence in their wake. When soldiers camped near your walls, hunger followed. When traders came through your gates, strange illnesses arrived soon after. To see the plague itself moving with soldiers was not a leap of imagination, it was simply the next step in a long history of war and disease walking hand in hand. Still, the stories had power. They fueled fear. They made people see plague not just as a natural disaster, but as an act of war. And that fear had consequences. It justified violence against minorities. It made rulers suspicious of enemies and allies alike. It turned an already unbearable catastrophe into something darker, something that seemed designed, orchestrated, deliberate. The rumor of plague warriors blurred the line between truth and myth. And in doing so, it planted an idea in Europe's collective memory, that the deadliest weapon of all might not be the sword, but the sickness carried by human hands. The plague was more than a sickness. It was a shattering of the human spirit. When the Black Death swept through Europe, it did not only destroy bodies. It destroyed trust, faith, and the fragile threads that held communities together. Imagine a city street in Florence. The bells toll every hour, not for worship, but for death. Carts rumble by, piled high with bodies. Priests chant prayers until their voices crack. And in the silence that follows, whispers rise. Someone must have done this. Someone must have brought the sickness here. That thought, repeated again and again, spread almost as fast as the plague itself. And so began a wave of blame. Neighbors accused neighbors of conspiring with plague warriors. Travelers were eyed with suspicion. Foreigners were turned away at city gates. Entire communities of Jews were slaughtered in pogroms, accused of poisoning wells, accused of aiding enemies who marched with pestilence at their side. The fear was not just of the sickness, but of betrayal. What if the man who sells you bread is carrying tainted flour? What if the knight who rides into your town is not a protector, but a bringer of death? What if plague warriors are already among you, unseen, striking down families in the night? This paranoia spread like wildfire. In some towns, guards patrolled wells and rivers. In others, people refused to touch coins or cloth for fear they had been infected by enemy hands. Simple acts, sharing water, greeting a traveler, taking in a stranger, suddenly felt dangerous. And in a world already weakened by famine and war, that kind of mistrust was devastating. Families abandoned each other. Parents left children to die alone. Wives left husbands in locked rooms, hoping to save themselves. Love, duty, loyalty, these things cracked under the unbearable weight of terror. Chroniclers of the time wrote of scenes so bleak they seemed unreal. Entire villages left empty, doors swinging open in the wind. Dogs and cats feeding on the corpses of their masters. Mass graves dug hastily, with no prayers, no markers, only the sound of shovels striking dirt. And yet, what haunted people most was not the death itself, but the feeling that it had been unleashed deliberately. That somewhere, someone had chosen to spread this horror. That an enemy army, unseen and unstoppable, was waging war not with swords or fire, but with sickness. To those who survived, this was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. It meant that death was not random. It meant that mankind itself was the author of its own suffering. The toll of the Black Death cannot be measured in numbers alone. Yes, millions perished. Yes, entire towns vanished. But fear carved even deeper wounds. It fractured trust between neighbors. It fueled hatred toward minorities. It turned every shadow into a threat, every stranger into a suspect, every cough into a sign that plague warriors had struck again. The human toll was not only physical, it was emotional, spiritual, psychological. And in that broken world, where grief was endless and answers were few, the legend of plague warriors only grew stronger. Because when people cannot explain tragedy, they search for enemies. And in the darkest chapter of the Middle Ages, the enemy was not just the plague. It was the belief that men themselves had harnessed death and set it loose upon the world. Were there really plague warriors? Or was it all nothing more than fear-driven propaganda? This question has haunted historians for centuries. Some argue, yes, it was real. Armies desperate for an edge might have tried anything. Poisoning wells, catapulting bodies, spreading terror as a weapon. After all, the 14th century was a brutal time. When soldiers face starvation, exhaustion, and disease every day, the line between strategy and cruelty blurred. But others insist it was all myth. A legend born in the fire of panic. Fear itself can spread faster than any plague. Picture this. A single rumor whispered in a village square. A story of men hurling corpses into cities. That rumor travels faster than any army. It sparks paranoia, unrest, even riots, without a single soldier lifting a sword. Propaganda? Or survival tactic? The truth is, both could be true. Historians comb through ancient letters and records. Some chronicles mention deliberate attempts at plague warfare. But these accounts are often second-hand, drenched in superstition, or written decades later. How much is fact, and how much is fear retold as memory? Think about it. Would a medieval commander really risk his own men handling diseased corpses? Wouldn't they fall sick too? It seems reckless, even suicidal. And yet, to those who believed in curses, divine punishment, or unseen forces, the idea of turning plague into a weapon may have felt possible. So we're left with a haunting paradox. Maybe plague warriors never existed in flesh and blood, but they existed in the mind. And in war, perception can be as deadly as reality. Imagine being a soldier, hearing whispers that your enemy wields the plague itself. Would you fight with courage? Or collapse under the weight of terror? Strategy or superstition? History doesn't give us a clear answer. But what it does show is that the fear of plague warriors was powerful enough to live on long after the bodies were buried. And sometimes, that's all it takes to shape history. The whispers of plague warriors did not die with the Middle Ages. They lingered, reshaping how people thought about war, fear, and unseen enemies. Because whether those warriors truly existed or not, the idea of them proved just as dangerous. Centuries later, in the age of science and empires, generals, kings, even governments would look back and wonder, could disease itself become a weapon? Think about that for a moment. The fear born in crumbling medieval cities echoed forward into modern times. During the American Civil War, Confederate forces were accused of trying to sell blankets infected with smallpox. In World War II, Japan's infamous Unit 731 carried out horrifying biological experiments, releasing plague-infected fleas into Chinese villages. And during the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union invested heavily in biological warfare programs. Programs designed not just to fight soldiers, but to cripple entire populations. All of this traces back to the same ancient question. Can terror itself be weaponized? The medieval rumors of plague warriors planted a seed that grew into a grim reality centuries later. But here's the most unsettling part. Even today, the legacy lives on. We live in a world where biological weapons are banned by international law, where treaties and watchdogs promise safety. And yet, whispers continue. Could a terrorist group unleash a man-made plague? Could a rogue state hide a secret stockpile? Could the next war be fought not with bombs, but with breath itself? The legacy of plague warfare isn't just about rotting bodies thrown across castle walls. It's about the shadow it cast, a shadow stretching into our present. Because once fear takes root in history, it never truly disappears. The plague warrior became less of a soldier, and more of a symbol of the darkest human instinct, to turn death itself into a weapon. And whether fact or legend, that symbol has haunted us for over 700 years. So maybe, the real legacy of plague warfare is this. Not the men who may or may not have existed, but the fear they left behind. Fear that still lingers in the corners of our world today. And so we return to the question that haunted us from the beginning. Were the plague warriors of the Middle Ages real soldiers, or phantoms born of fear? The truth may never be pinned down. What is clear is that the terror they inspired was as potent as the sickness itself. In an age where rumors spread faster than armies could march, belief could shape reality. Villages fled at the sound of their name. Fortresses surrendered before a single arrow was loosed. Fear became its own form of warfare. Some chronicles whisper of men who carried death on their blades, while others dismiss them as shadows of the imagination. Perhaps both are true. The plague killed millions, but the stories of those who wielded it as a weapon still linger, as if the dead never truly left the battlefield. Even today, the idea echoes. Military strategists study biological warfare with a grim seriousness, while ghost stories of the past remind us that not all weapons are made of steel and fire. Sometimes the deadliest weapon is belief itself. So, were the plague warriors real? Or were they the ultimate ghost story of the Middle Ages, a tale that survives not because of proof, but because of the power it holds over our minds? If you want more untold wartime mysteries, subscribe so you don't miss the next story.